separate but equal is no longer acceptable. On May 17, 1954, Supreme Court ruled racial segregation in schools was unconstitutional. In the case of Brown v. Board of Education, this ruling was a way for integration and a victory for civil rights movement. In 1969, the Children with Specific Learning Disabilities Act, which was included in the Education of the Handicapped Act of 1970, was passed. Federal law mandated support services for students with learning disabilities. 6 years later, Congress passed the Education for All Handicapped Children Act in 1975. President Gerald Ford signed that act. This law officially recognized specific learning disability as a category eligible for special education funding and service. Starting in 1965, the U.S. Department of Education Office of Civil Rights has tracked data on African American students related to their enrollment in special education. They are responsible for enforcing several laws that affect school practices related to the overrepresentation of African American students. Disproportionality means there are more or fewer children from a particular group who are experiencing a given situation than we would expect, based on the group's representation in the general population. Overrepresentation also is discussed with African American students. Overrepresentation has figured prominently in court cases for many years. In the 1970s, there were 3 cases that talked about overrepresentation of African American students. Diana versus California State Board of Education in 1970, Johnson versus San Francisco Unified School District in 1971, and Larry P. versus Riles in California in 1979. These found that school practices were discriminatory. The court found in the court case of 1970, Larry P. versus Riley, that standardized intelligence tests had a discriminatory impact on African American students. This caused them to be overrepresented in classes for what at that time was called the educable mentally retarded. What was known as the Education for All Handicapped Children Act is renamed in 1990 to IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Act. The term disability now replaces the word handicapped. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is designed to ensure that students with disabilities receive a free, appropriate public education. Clinton signed the IDEA amendments in 1997. This is part of what he had said. Our job is not yet done. All of you know that despite this progress, young people with disabilities still drop out of high school at twice the rate of their peers drop out of high school and into less certain futures. For those who stay in school, lower expectations and exclusion are still far too common. The 1997 reauthorization of the IDEA Act was stressing the importance of efforts to prevent the intensification of problems connected with mislabeling and high dropout rates among diverse children with disabilities. Looking at research, Congress found that there continued to be more African American children in special education than would be expected based on the percentage of diverse learners in the general population. Congress also found students with disabilities were more likely than other students to come from families with low socioeconomic status and families with parents who had less formal education. Starting in 1998, the annual reports to Congress on the implementation of IDEA have included tables summarizing the ethnicity and race data for students with disabilities. According to Yell, Meadows, Drasko, Schreiner in 2009, students with EBD display a wide range of characteristics with a disproportionate representation of African American students and males. They are identified later than students with other disabilities, placed in more restricted settings, and studies suggest that they display worse social behavior and academic outcomes than other disability categories. This graph from the New York State Education Department in 2004-2005 is just one example that shows the disproportionate representation of Blacks and Hispanics that are labeled ED and LD. As you can see looking at these charts from 2002, 2003, and 2006, students 14 and older with disabilities, African American students, and American Indian students had a higher dropout rate. July 26 of 2012, President Barack Obama signed the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans Executive Order. This initiative is to improve education outcomes for African Americans. Part of this is promoting a positive school climate that does not rely on methods that result in discipline only, and decreasing the disproportionate representation of referrals to special education by addressing the core cause of the referral. Now comes the big question, why? Why is disproportionate representation of culturally diverse students in special education happening? If there's a higher number of students in a school with a certain ethnic or minority enrolled in a special education than should be by statistical standards, there's a possibility that some of the students may not be truly disabled and may have been identified incorrectly. Children who may stand out from others, even if their behavior isn't significantly different, may be labeled in special education. If they don't get proper help at home, they may fall behind in school. Low-income school districts may also have the least qualified teachers with least resources at their disposal to teach students with needs. A high frequency of behavior difficulties that goes along with poor classroom management in lower-income schools often leads to special education referrals and placements. English language learners who are performing below grade level sometimes are also put into special education classes. As educators need to recognize and accommodate cultural differences in minority groups. We need to use appropriate assessment strategies for English language learners and other ethnic minorities. We as teachers need to have high expectations of all of our students. If students are struggling, we need to be able to look at data and provide interventions for those students. Disproportionality is a concern. According to Harry and Klinger, 2006, when students are receiving special education services, they tend to remain in special education classes, and they are likely to encounter a limited, less rigorous curriculum. As educators, we need to make sure we have training to develop our knowledge of cultural beliefs and expectations, also to be aware of diversity we may have with students. We need to develop relationships with our students and their families. Hopefully in the future, sooner rather than later, we will not see a large number of disproportionate representation with students in special education.